Okay, let's unpack this. Welcome back to the deep dive. Our mission today is very specific. We're not here to debate policy or sift through decades of statistics.
Right.
Instead, what we're doing is constructing a complete participant-driven anatomy of one specific historical moment. The crack cocaine explosion that completely redefined New York City in the 80s and 90s.
Exactly. We're trying to cut through all the headlines, all the sensationalism, to really get a picture of what the street-level reality actually looked like.
What it felt like.
What it felt like, how it functioned. We're using the firsthand testimony of the people who built, organized, and ran these multi-million-dollar organizations. These were the active participants in what became this just devastating economic system.
And our sources, they give us an incredible, almost surgical roadmap. We're charting the emergence, the brutal organization, and of course the devastating downfall of these major crack operations. And the place to start, it's always geography.
It has to be.
We need to establish the ground zero for supply. And that sits strategically at the northern tip of Manhattan, Washington Heights.
Washington Heights is absolutely critical. For anyone studying this era, you have to understand its role as the supply valve. In the 80s and 90s, this neighborhood became the primary enclave for newly arrived Dominican immigrants.
And that demographic distinction, it wasn't just a cultural factor, was it?
Oh, not at all. It was a foundational piece of the drug trade's supply chain hierarchy. I mean, it was the piece.
So let's drill down into that hierarchy. You have the major cartels, Colombia, Mexican, they're bringing these massive loads of powder cocaine into the country. Who do they trust to then retail or wholesale that product in a place like New York?
The source analysis makes it really clear where the preference was.
Yeah.
If a cartel needed retail distribution in NYC, they overwhelmingly relied on two main diaspora groups. You had the Dominicans, concentrated in Washington Heights, right at the top of Manhattan.
And the Jamaicans.
And the Jamaicans, who often operated these incredibly strong strongholds, primarily in Brooklyn. They functioned as this crucial bridge between the international wholesale and the local street-level retail game.
What's fascinating and also kind of sickening is the business calculation behind that choice. It wasn't arbitrary at all.
No.
The wholesale suppliers, the Colombians, they explicitly preferred dealing with Dominicans over, as they often put it, regular American black drug dealers in Harlem.
And that preference, it's rooted in these layers of, bias and logistics. It might have stemmed from ingrained cultural discrimination, absolutely, but functionally, the Dominicans offered something critical.
Which was?
An incredibly close-knit, community-structured organization.
Yeah.
Their kinship networks, their family ties, it all provided a perceived level of internal security and reliability.
So less likely to have informants.
Much less prone to internal police informants or, rapid system collapse if one person gets arrested.
Yeah.
It made them better business partners for moving high-volume, large-scale product reliably. They were seen as, I guess, vertically integrated.
They owned the supply chain logistics for Manhattan. And that brings us directly down the island to Harlem, where the retail operation really took shape. We can focus on the rise of the Harlem crack kingpin, known as Unique.
Right.
This is where the business model, the anatomy of it all, really comes into focus, because Harlem dealers had a very distinct disadvantage.
A huge one.
Securing consistent wholesale product without those established direct Dominican connections.
That's the critical pivot point in the whole story.
Yeah.
Unique, who is identified as Jamaican, he had to find a creative way to bridge this gap. His background offered his sort of cultural access point that let him secure supply uptown from the Dominicans. He navigated a barrier that often just locked out typical Black American dealers from getting to that higher echelon of product.
And the method he chose for acquisition, it wasn't just about buying the final product. It was about vertical integration.
Yes.
He wasn't immediately buying massive wholesale kilos of ready-made crack. At first, he was buying smaller, though still significant, amounts of powder cocaine from the Dominicans, specifically so he could cook it himself. This one detail is arguably the most essential entrepreneurial decision he made.
It is the ultimate lesson in market control. I mean, think about it. When you are moving a high-volume product that is based on immediate, potent results, which is what crack is, the reason for self-cooking is exclusively to control the potency and the quality of the rock.
Right. Your brand.
It's your brand. If you are selling standardized rocks that hit harder and more reliably than your competitors, you aren't just selling a commodity anymore. You are selling a premium product.
And that premium product gives you pricing power. You can sustain a higher price point than the dealer 2 blocks over who's buying, cut up pre-made vials from somebody else. This proprietary cooking process ensured his product was superior, allowing him to systematically dominate his territory in Harlem.
And that business savvy, it translated directly into leverage in his supply negotiations. I mean, our sources illustrate the massive profit potential gained through that efficiency. Once Unique established his volume and his reliability, he was eventually able to negotiate his wholesale price for a kilo down to about $15,000.
15,000. And for context, what was the prevailing market rate in New York City at that exact same time?
It was hovering around $22,000 per kilo.
So think about that differential. That's a $7,000 saving per kilo before he even applies heat and turns it into thousands of smaller, more profitable units of crack.
That $7,000 is pure guaranteed profit, gained purely through better supply connections and negotiation. It just proves that this was a system where business acumen was just as vital as, brute force.
Absolutely. So the organization moves with just astonishing speed, from securing a better supply to establishing an indisputable physical territory. Unique began his empire in Harlem, initially around 117th Street. But the spot that truly defined his early success, the landmark operation, was established at 107th Street when he was barely 16 years old.
16. That scale, run by a teenager, it just underscores the explosive nature of the crack economy. It was a gold rush.
And a spot like that, a high-value, high-traffic location, it did not come without a fight. The resistance was immediate from the established local hustlers.
Of course.
They confronted him directly, told him, "You can't hustle here." And this resistance and the violent, definitive response to it, that's what marked the legitimate, bloody birth of his turf.
The consolidation of that 107th Street territory was, it was a declaration of war disguised as a business opening. Unique's own testimony details how he met that resistance and forced immediate violent compliance.
What does he say?
She describes coming down and sitting on the curb with a solo shotgun, sitting on that like if it was a chair. The visual is everything. It's not just a threat. It's an active enforcement detail. You don't negotiate a high-volume location like that. You seize it, and then you defend it with overwhelming immediate force.
And the success of that enforcement, the ability to keep that spot open and running 24/7, it resulted in a profit scale that is just hard to wrap your mind around. This was not a small corner operation netting, $50,000 a month.
Not even close.
Unique grew his business into what reliable sources describe as a $3 million a week empire.
$3 million a week in cash. To sustain that kind of cash flow requires an organizational infrastructure that mirrors a mid-sized corporation, just, operating outside the law.
You have to visualize the logistics of that.
Exactly. To move that kind of volume, the 107th Street operation couldn't have just a couple of guys hanging out. You would need multiple layers. Shift managers, multiple sets of lookouts in every corner leading to the spot, runners constantly ferrying product from stash house.
And an internal security force.
The muscle. To ensure the safety of the cash and the product, you needed guys with guns, period.
And that entire system had to be running 24 hours a day. Think about the risk mitigation required. They weren't just worrying about rival crews.
No, you're worrying about police raids, you're worrying about internal theft, and you're worrying about the complex process of counting, securing, and potentially laundering these immense piles of cash. And the sources talk about what that money smelled like.
What did it smell like?
It smelled like rubber bands and sweat, just stacks and stacks of it. The fact that a system could sustain that volume, overseen by a teenager, it just speaks to a deeply rationalized and brutally efficient criminal enterprise.
Let's delve into the retail experience that supported this volume, because it reveals a fascinating customer service model. The core function was speed and reliability.
Right.
If a customer was desperate, they needed to buy crack, the cocaine cooked into rock quickly and reliably. The structure, the spot, with its steel doors and reinforced defenses, was designed for high-throughput transactions.
It was like a fast food drive-through for drugs.
And within that high-throughput, lawless environment, we find evidence of surprisingly nuanced customer retention strategies.
It's incredible.
We hear testimony, particularly from Ellie Sadiq speaking about a spot in the Bronx, that they maintained a literal bag of $1 bills. And this was specifically to cover customers who were $1 short on a $10 bottle or vial.
That is business acumen, plain and simple. They were providing an experience, not just a service. In a high-stakes, high-volume operation, if a user is $1 short, you might lose that customer forever if they have to go somewhere else.
You front them the dollar.
You front them the dollar, you ensure the immediate transaction closes, but more importantly, You guarantee that customers return. It's an investment in loyalty and retention, and it mirrors the most successful retail strategies you'd see anywhere.
It also speaks to the immediate availability and the relative affordability of the product. The sources give us a sense of the pricing structure from back then. Retail powder cocaine was available at that time for around $50 for half a gram.
Right. For more established, traditional local sources, like a bar owner, are sources called Godfather Putsch in the Bronx.
$50 for half a gram of powder coke was the baseline for a more, let's say, traditional user. But when Unique System and others like the notorious Yellow Top Screw hit the streets with crack.
They revolutionized consumption. Crack was cheaper, it was more immediately potent, and it was designed for rapid addictive use. The volume and the structure, they changed the entire dynamic of consumption and retail pricing.
And if we look at the broader landscape, this era was quickly defined by just intense economic warfare. This wasn't just about Unique. We see this pressure everywhere in the testimony.
It was a race to the bottom on price and a race to the top on quality.
The competition was always aimed at product dominance and price point. And while we don't have Unique's direct competitors' full breakdown, the sources reinforced the necessity of having the best product.
The internal logic was straightforward. If a user had $75 available to get high, they would invariably find an extra $25 to pay $100 for the better, more potent product. Unique's controlled cooking process was the ultimate competitive defense against mass-market, lower-quality rivals.
And this intense competition, it led to absolutely ruthless scaling and pricing tactics. We hear about another major player, Chongo, and his market pressure was notorious.
Chongo's operation was pure economic warfare. He was running $3 vials against competitors who were charging $5 for a lower-quality product.
Think about that. $3 versus $5, that's a massive difference to an addict.
It's everything. And that differential, coupled with promotions like buy one, get one free, and running his spots 24 hours a day with shifts and managers, it ensured that the consumer chose volume and affordability. He could literally drive competitors out of the market entirely.
So you have Unique competing on quality and Chongo competing on price and volume, but then you also had branding.
Yes, the Yellow Tops, T-Tone's crew.
Tell us about that. What was the deal with the Yellow Top crew?
They understood branding before anyone. Their crack came in vials with distinctive yellow caps. So if you were a user, you knew exactly what you were getting. You'd tell someone, go get me the Yellow Tops. It was a guarantee of a certain quality, a certain weight. It was like the McDonald's of crack. You knew the product was consistent.
So it's a three-front war: quality, price, and branding.
And that price war, that constant need to maximize profit from every single unit, it created the foundational business training on the street.
Right?
We hear Ali Sadiq recounting his initial lessons, starting at just 14 years old. He bought a 50-pack of crack rocks and was immediately instructed that he had to cut it up to make 120 vials from it.
So turn a $50 investment into $120.
Instantly. That lesson, how to multiply your initial outlay through cutting and packaging, that was the first step toward survival and scale in that hyper-competitive retail environment. That was street-level business school.
This focus on maximizing financial gain, it brings us to a really complex and contradictory subject: the evolving cultural code between the dealer and the user. The sources point out a clear, distinct generational shift regarding drug use among those who were selling it.
In the early 80s, you see drug dealer use of cocaine was, well, it was accepted. It was even glamorized. You think of the cultural touchstones of the time.
Scarface.
Scarface was sniffing coke. It was an indulgence, a sign of success and power.
But by 1988, 1989, as the crack epidemic matured and operations like Unique's and the Yellow Tops were generating serious systemic money, using coke, especially crack, became taboo. It was looked down upon by successful hustlers.
And this shift, it wasn't driven by morality, not at all. It was driven by business pragmatism and survival.
Don't get high on your own supply.
The ultimate rule. The successful dealers realized they needed absolute distance and clarity to manage the massive financial volume, the intense security risks, the constant threat of rival organizations, and the police. Getting high, especially on the erratic, paranoia-inducing high of crack, was fundamentally incompatible with running a sophisticated $3 million a week organization. The user became unreliable, a liability.
It's this tragic, almost bizarre sense of self-preservation. They're facilitating the addiction, but they know they can't afford to be consumed by it themselves. And despite the sheer destruction crack was causing in their communities, a highly surprising and contradictory code of honor still persisted among some of them.
You see that cognitive dissonance perfectly articulated by Ali Sadiq. Even though he started hustling at 14, he maintained what he considered to be strict standards.
Which were what?
He never sold to children or pregnant women.
But how does that logic hold up? I mean, how did he reconcile that internal honor amongst thieves' code, this desire to protect certain vulnerable segments, with the raw, undeniable fact that the product he was selling was, in his own words, ruining everything?
I don't think they could, really.
It was destroying the families of the adults he did sell to.
That is the ultimate ethical tragedy of the era. The testimony suggests they maintained this belief that they were simply seizing a financial opportunity that mainstream society had denied them. Crack, in that context, became known as the ghetto lottery ticket.
The ghetto lottery ticket.
For young black kids, seeing millions of dollars suddenly flowing into the ghetto, it created this seductive feeling of possibility. A sharp contrast to the poverty they grew up witnessing, watching their mothers struggle, seeing no legal path out. The hustlers convinced themselves they were participating in an economic revolution, not an addiction crisis.
And that economic revolution came with an absolutely astronomical cost in lawlessness and violence. You were in New York during that time. You can speak to that sudden violent change in atmosphere.
Oh yeah, the sources mention these seismic shifts in neighborhoods that were previously considered stable. Take Parkchester in the Bronx. In the early 80s, it was considered a desirable, reliable area, a place to be. And then the flood of drug money, the turf wars, the desperation that crack brought, it quickly turned it high crime. I remember people moving there only to have their cars stolen, not once, but repeatedly. The environment changed that quickly, that violently, and that systemically, because these high-value drug spots had to be defended 24/7.
Then that required constant conflict. Unique's Manhattan operation was no exception. We hear of his conflicts, including dealing with a rival organization supposedly connected to a figure named Calderon from the Bronx.
Right, and Calderon's operation was notorious for extorting people and charging rent on Brooks Avenue.
Yeah.
It was a whole other level of organized crime.
So it wasn't just selling drugs.
No, Calderon's system was a pure protection racket built around the drug sales. They demanded tribute from other dealers. The sources confirm the inevitable outcome. Unique's organization was later thought to have participated in a shooting that targeted one of this rival organization's henchmen.
A business expense.
That's what it was,
Yeah.
a necessary business expense of establishing market share. You use violence to enforce compliance and eliminate threats to your ability to operate. It was a life or death balance sheet.
But it's crucial we pause and recognize that this hyper-violent, generational, crack-driven ecosystem wasn't the only organized crime game in New York City at the time.
Not by a long shot.
Our sources provide a fascinating look at a parallel older underworld operating simultaneously in Chinatown.
Correct. The sources detail gangs like the Ghost Shadow and Fire Dragon. Their territories were rigidly defined and deeply insular. Mott Street, Bayard Street, Elizabeth Street. But their focus was fundamentally different from the crack wars.
They weren't in the crack game.
It's not at all. Their criminal economy revolved entirely around traditional vice, specifically illegal gambling operations. We hear names like Paigao and Mang.
Can you explain those?
Paigao is a traditional Chinese tile game, kind of like dominoes, played for extremely high stakes. Mong is a form of mahjong, or there were variations of high-stakes 13-card poker. These operations were high profit, but very low profile, running out of storefront basements or rented high-rise condos, primarily targeting the Chinese community.
So while Unique is sitting on a curb with a shotgun, fighting over $10 vials and managing shift changes in Harlem,
These older gangs are focused on maintaining the sanctity and security of a secretive, high-stakes tile game in a basement in Chinatown. It just highlights how different criminal economies function simultaneously, defined by different levels of visibility and different degrees of violence.
it's a completely different world.
Precisely. The crack trade was hyper-violent, it was generational, and it was extremely visible, destroying communities from the inside out. The Chinese gangs maintained a much more insular, older structure. Their violence was often internally directed or related to maintaining the sanctity of those gambling operations, protecting the cash box and the high rollers. Not fighting street-level territorial wars for consumers. They operated outside the law, but according to a centuries-old playbook.
As we transition now into the final phase of this deep dive, we have to confront the inevitable downfall, the legal reckoning that followed these empires.
It's had to come.
When a business is generating $3 million a week, it is generating the kind of evidence the federal government simply cannot ignore. This is where the true devastating weight of the federal system came down.
The cost of running an empire of this scale was measured in decades, sometimes centuries, of imprisonment. We see one source detailing the immediate existential threat they faced: life in prison under ICO statutes.
For listeners who may not be steeped in legal acronyms, can you quickly contextualize RLICO for us?
Sure. ICO, the Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, is the government's weapon of choice against structured criminal operations. It allows them to charge individuals not just for the crime they committed today, but for participating in a pattern of criminal enterprise.
So they target the whole organization.
The entire organization, the cooks, the lookouts, the managers, not just the street dealer. It was designed to dismantle the entire structure, and it often came with severe asset forfeiture, meaning they didn't just take your freedom, they took every dollar you made and everything you bought with it.
And the sentences reflected this comprehensive attack. One source recounted an initial plea offer of 34 years, an amount they called insulting for a first-time offense.
It just illustrates the aggressive stance of the government. They were using the sheer volume and organization of the business to set these catastrophic guidelines.
Unique. The Harlem kingpin ultimately received a 32-year sentence. Considering the federal guidelines and the staggering weight of drugs his organization handled, 32 years was actually considered the low end of his guideline.
The volume, the sheer mass of product that the prosecutors could prove, that was the fatal factor legally. It set the stage for decades behind bars.
What's fascinating about Unique's legal fight is the dynamics of cooperation, which is often the only path for individuals facing that kind of time. But he chose not to cooperate.
Right. His priority, as it's detailed in the source material, was not securing a reduced sentence for himself. It was leveraging his position to secure immunity for his immediate family, ensuring they were released from any charges.
A grim calculation.
It was a calculation of self-sacrifice for familial protection. And his legal strategy, once that was secured, it turned to the offensive. He focused intensely on trying to chase the money trail of the main informant who brought him down.
How so?
He argued that the informant couldn't actually prove Unique made enough money to justify the government's claims about the scale of the operation. It's the ultimate legal chess match, challenging the financial scope of the conspiracy to undermine the testimony.
And the bitter irony here.
The bitter irony is that the person who did cooperate against Unique also ended up receiving 32 years.
Wow.
It just highlights the often minimal benefit of cooperation when you are dealing with federal conspiracy cases involving these truly massive documented drug volumes. Even cooperation might not save you from those harsh mandatory minimums.
And to understand the true disproportionate impact of the legislation driving these sentences, we have to look beyond New York for a moment.
We do.
The source material provides a necessary parallel with the Rayful Edmond organization in Washington, D.C. Edmond was a massive cocaine legend in D.C., and his sentences were just catastrophic.
Edmond faced multiple life sentences and a total sentence of 400 years.
400 years.
That astronomical figure, 400 years, is the perfect illustration of the profound, disproportionate impact of the original crack and cocaine laws that were passed by Congress in the mid to late 80s.
And what made those laws so devastating was the infamous 100-to-1 disparity. Can you quickly explain what that meant for someone caught with crack versus someone caught with powder cocaine?
It was simple, and it was devastatingly biased. Under the initial laws, you needed 100 times the amount of powder cocaine to trigger the same mandatory minimum sentence as crack cocaine.
100 times.
So holding 5 grams of crack, which is relatively little, carried the same 5-year mandatory minimum sentence as holding 500 grams of powder cocaine. And because crack was the drug disproportionately used and sold in poor, primarily black urban areas, this legislation was a direct funnel for racial disparity into the federal prison system.
That system was eventually recognized as flawed, though. What happened to sentences like Rayful Edmonds?
Well, due to changes in those crack cocaine disparity laws, which came much, much later, Edmond and others saw those original crippling sentences taken back. Both his life sentences and the massive 400-year sentence were removed.
Decades later.
Decades later. It illustrates a profound legal recognition that the original legislation was fundamentally flawed, ineffective, and overly punitive against a specific demographic.
And this brings us to the political context, which the source material rightly calls sobering. You've noted the sickening part of this whole tough on crime era
Yeah.
is that the legislation that enforced these extreme disproportionate sentences was often championed and pushed through by Democrats. This was the political party that traditionally claimed to be advocates for poor and black communities.
There was a bipartisan political failure. It was driven by fear and political expediency. In the 80s and 90s, no politician wanted to be labeled soft on crime.
Right.
And the crack epidemic provided the perfect political platform to prove your toughness. Democrats, trying to distance themselves from a perceived liberalism, they embraced punitive measures just as fiercely as Republicans. The source points out the painful hypocrisy. People like Joe Biden, who later advocated for pardons, had previously written legislation that locked up far more people for forever.
A deep disconnect.
A deep, damaging disconnect between the lawmakers and the communities they claim to serve and protect.
So the legal consequences, they closed the door on these empires on the street. But the criminal economy simply moved indoors. We have to briefly look at the post-empire survival. Life inside the federal system, which, according to the source material, was still highly organized and highly profitable for the drug trade.
Prison life is just a continuation of the economy outside, only it's exponentially more high stakes and highly priced. We get specific, shocking data on this internal market. A prison gram, described as the size of an M&M peanut of black tar heroin, sold for $600 at Big Sandy Federal Penitentiary.
$600 for an amount the size of a peanut M&M.
It underscores the extreme demand and the risk involved in the supply chain inside the walls. And this trade wasn't random. It was highly organized. It was often supplied and controlled by powerful internal organizations like the DC Blacks Gang, which had their own plugs, their own distribution networks, and protocols for moving product behind the walls.
And beyond the drug economy, the social organization inside was ruthlessly controlled by these internal codes. We see the influence of the major prison structures, like the Mexican Mafia or La M.
The culture inside was intensely brutal. And it was often dictated by self-enforced rules that superseded any authority the correctional staff had. There's a vivid detail about the raw reality of the IME's power.
What was that?
An inmate who had only 10 days left on his federal sentence was nearly killed by the Mexican Mafia structure for writing an underage girl through letters, meaning they discovered he was corresponding inappropriately with a minor.
10 days left on his sentence.
10 days. That lack of consideration shows the absolute power of the internal code. The IME's self-enforced rules are absolute and unforgiving. The organization's internal intelligence, the guard who informed them of the letters, knew the code, and the IME decided that even with 10 days left, the violation was unforgivable. They showed zero consideration for his pending release date. It just underscores that in that environment, the internal code and the structure of the gang were the supreme authority, more powerful than the state or the legal system that initially incarcerated them.
To bring this comprehensive deep dive to a close, we've successfully mapped the complete anatomy of the crack era through this participant testimony. We started with the geographic control of the Washington Heights Dominican suppliers,
Who served as that essential vertical bridge for the Mexican and Colombian wholesale product.
We followed that supply down into Harlem, examining the rise of these entrepreneurial kings like Unique, who mastered both product potency through self-cooking and turf defense with decisive, visible brute force to build a multi-million-dollar enterprise.
We documented the cultural shift, where the hustle became so big, so high risk, that successful dealers had to reject their own product. They recognized that control, not consumption, was the only path to survival. We saw how this economic promise was viewed as a ghetto lottery ticket, contrasting so sharply with the violent realities of turf wars and community destruction.
And finally, we detailed the devastating legal reckoning, where the sheer volume of these empires triggered the full weight of federal RICO statutes and the unjust 100-to-1 crack disparity laws, leading to catastrophic sentences that were later deemed unfair and disproportionate by the very government that enacted them.
It's just an overwhelming story of economic ingenuity operating within a legislative catastrophe.
And that leaves us with one final provocative thought for you, the listener, to carry forward.
Given the historical fact that the original crack and cocaine sentencing laws, which led to these outrageous 30-plus year and 400-year sentences, were eventually recognized as failures and changed by the government to alleviate their extreme penalties. And given that the initial harsh political push for those laws was demonstrably bipartisan, what does the entire trajectory of the crack era say about society's ability to use the legal system to address deep-seated social and economic problems versus merely reacting with severe, politically motivated punitive measures?
Was the priority ever truly to heal the communities and address the roots of poverty and limited opportunity, or was the ultimate goal simply punishment and political posturing? We'll leave you to consider that painful question. That was the deep dive into Harlem's crack explosion and the anatomy of a forgotten empire. We'll see you next time.